On the 7th of September, 2023, in a packed courthouse in Darien, Georgia, the people of Sapelo Island rose and left the hearing that would decide what could be built on their land. They were not walking out in protest. The last ferry of the day was leaving Meridian Dock, and there is no bridge to Sapelo and no other way home. Behind them, the three members of the McIntosh County Zoning Board stayed in the room and took up their pencils and went on. First, the ground those three men were deciding. Sapelo Island runs 16,500 acres, and the state of Georgia owns roughly 97% of it. Hogg Hummock holds 434 of the remaining acres, the last intact Gullah Geechee community on the Georgia coast, with fewer than 50 year-round residents, no doctor, and a single general store. At least 13 black settlements stood on Sapelo a century ago. One stands now, and a standing rule about to be broken held that no house there could exceed 1,400 square feet. Hold that courthouse. 3 men, a room emptying out, a boat that would not wait. This account will bring you back into that room, and you will hear what they decided after the island had gone home. Chapter 1. 5,000 Acres of Marsh. Thomas Spalding was not yet 30 when he took the south end of Sapelo Island, and he paid for it with his dead father's land. In 1802 he held 5,000 acres of salt marsh, live oak, and high sandy ground at the island's southern tip, financed in part by selling the St. Simon's plantation his father James had left him. He had been admitted to the Georgia bar 7 years earlier and never practiced. He had come to farm the coast, and he had come with a theory. Within a year of that purchase, 75 men and women bought for Spalding, and for his neighbor, John Cooper, would walk into a tidal creek on St. Simon's Island and make a decision the state of Georgia has never entirely explained. The account returns to that creek before long. The theory was agricultural, and for its day it was serious. Spalding rotated his fields when his neighbors exhausted theirs. He diversified when they gambled. In 1805, he set sugarcane into Sapelo's sandy soil, in a state the planting authorities had written off as too cold for the crop, and the cane took. Sugar spread from Sapelo up the banks of the Altamaha River and across the tidewater. He built mills to grind it, the earliest turned by oxen, and he built them out of tabby. Tabby is a cement of crushed oyster shell, lime, sand, and water. Spalding did not invent it. He proved that it would stand. The shells came out of the middens heaped along the island's western shore, mounds of discarded meals left by people who had lived on Sapelo 4,000 years before any Scotsman's son arrived to inherit them. Spalding's enslaved workers dug the shells, burned them for lime, and poured the walls. Planters from Darien southward copied the method. Those walls stand on Sapelo now, at Chocolate and at the old sugar works, roofless and white in the palmetto. He became the leading grower of Sea Island cotton in the state, and he wrote for the Southern Agriculturist and the Southern Cultivator, giving away methods his rivals would have paid for. He also set down, once, a summary of how he meant Sapelo to be run. The plantation should operate, he said, without the interference of white man. The sentence has been quoted admiringly for 2 centuries. It describes the absence of white overseers on Sapelo Island, which is accurate. It does not describe the presence of some 400 black men, women, and children who could not leave it. Spalding worked his island on the task system rather than the gang. A hand was set a measured job, and when the job was done, the day was done, and the hours remaining belonged, in a narrow and revocable sense, to the hand who had earned them. On the Sea Islands this was common practice. Spalding carried it further. After his first seasons, he dismissed his white overseers altogether and set enslaved men to supervise enslaved men. He believed the arrangement made his workers self-reliant. It also made his labor cheaper to police, and on an island reachable only by boat, no less contained. The people he bought he settled in small villages he called hammocks, grouped by the region of Africa they had been taken from, on the reasoning that the newly landed would acclimate faster among their own. Their names were Behavior and Riverside, Drinkwater, Hanging Bull, Lumber Landing. The names would outlast the reasoning, which returns the account to the creek at Dunbar. In 1803, a group of 75 Igbo captives was purchased at Savannah for Spalding and Cooper together. Put aboard a small coasting vessel for the journey south, they rose against her crew, drove her aground on St. Simon's Island, and walked into the salt water at the mouth of Dunbar Creek. By most accounts, a dozen of them drowned there. The survivors were divided between the two planters who had paid for them. Some were carried across the Sound to Sapelo, and their descendants are on the island today. Consider, then, what one man assembled on one island. 5,000 acres in 1802, and the whole of Sapelo, some 16,000 acres, by the 1840s. 421 people held in bondage by 1825, 310 of them on Sapelo itself. Seats in the United States Congress, the Georgia House, and the Georgia Senate. A founder and a president of the Bank of Darien. One of the commissioners Georgia sent to fix its disputed boundary with Florida. And a shelf of published writing in which he confessed misgivings about the institution of slavery, which he practiced without interruption for 49 years, on an island from which none of those he owned could walk away. Thomas Spalding died in January of 1851. His will granted freedom to the man who had run the island for him. That man was not a white overseer, because Spalding kept none. He was an enslaved Muslim from the highlands of Guinea, and when the British warships stood off the Georgia coast, Thomas Spalding armed him. His name was Bilali. Chapter 2. The Man with the Muskets. Bilali Muhammad was born in Timbo, in the highlands of the Fouta Djallon, in what is now the Republic of Guinea, sometime in the 1760s or 70s. He was Fulani. His family were Muslims of the scholarly kind, and they had him taught to read and write Arabic, and taught him the law of his faith before he was old enough to be worth stealing. He was taken as a teenager. He crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a ship, and he came ashore in the Bahamas, and there he was sold to a physician named Bell on Middle Caicos. Bell was a loyalist. He had fled the American Revolution and been resettled on that island by a grateful crown. For 10 years, a man dispossessed by the American Revolution owned a man dispossessed by the Atlantic. In 1802, Bilali was sold again to a trader who carried him to Georgia, and Thomas Spalding bought him. Spalding bought the family with him, or most of it. Bilali's wife was called Phoebe. They had 7 daughters, and they had 12 sons, of whom the record retains nothing but the number. On Sapelo, Spalding made him head driver over more than 400 people. The driver on a sea island plantation was the plantation. He assigned the tasks. He judged when a task was finished. He kept the peace among people who had been taken from a dozen different countries and set down together in a marsh. And in the summers, when the planters fled the coastal fevers for the uplands, the driver ran the island alone for weeks at a stretch. Spalding, who had dismissed his white overseers, was often not there at all. Bilali did not hide what he was. He wore a fez. He kept a prayer rug and prayed on it facing east 5 times in the day. He kept the fast of Ramadan and marked the feasts that end it. Phoebe prayed beside him 3 times daily, telling a string of beads. On an island owned by a Scottish Presbyterian, in a state that had made Christianity the price of decency, a Fulani scholar practiced his religion in the open for half a century, and no one stopped him. During the War of 1812, with British warships standing in the Sounds off the Georgia coast and a landing expected, Thomas Spalding did a thing that would have appalled every planter in the Low Country. He opened his stores and handed out roughly 80 muskets to the men he owned, and he put Bilali in command of them. Spalding told the story afterwards. In his telling, Bilali gave him an answer, which was that he would answer for every man of the true faith on Sapelo Island and for none of the Christian dogs his master owned. The line has been repeated for 2 centuries. It is worth noticing that the only surviving record of what Bilali said comes to us through the mouth of the man who owned him. The British did not land. The muskets were collected. And in the 1820s, in a house on a slave plantation in the state of Georgia, Bilali Muhammad sat down and wrote 13 pages in Arabic. For 100 years, scholars called it a diary. It is not a diary. It is a reproduction drawn from memory across an ocean and 40 years of bondage, of passages from the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, a foundational treatise of Maliki jurisprudence. He had carried a law book out of Africa in his head. The pages sit today in the Hogg Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Georgia, 100 miles inland from the field he wrote them in. Set the arithmetic of that one life beside the arithmetic of Spalding's. A boy taken from Timbo in his teens, 10 years on Middle Caicos, more than 400 people under his command on Sapelo, roughly 80 muskets in 1813, 7 daughters and 12 sons whose fates the record does not hold, 13 pages of Arabic law copied from memory. 1 island hurricane in 1824, which island accounts say he survived by driving everyone he could reach into the tabby buildings his own hands had poured. 1 manumission granted by a dead man's will after half a century of labor, and 1 grave in a place nobody now can name. When Thomas Spalding died in 1851, his will set Bilali free. Bilali was an old man by then, and ill. He left Sapelo for the mainland and died there at about 80. The accounts say he was buried with his Quran and his prayer rug. Where, no one recorded. His daughters stayed. Most of them lie in the burying ground at Behavior, under the live oaks, in the old settlement on the island's eastern side. The families who came out of slavery on Sapelo carried a small set of surnames, and their descendants carry them still: Bailey and Hall, Bell and Walker. Generations later, the island's own historian, a woman named Cornelia Bailey, would count Bilali Muhammad among her ancestors. Those names are still on Sapelo. And in the spring of 1865, for the first time in the island's recorded history, the people who bore them were permitted to buy the ground they were standing on. Chapter 3. 13 Settlements. William Tecumseh Sherman signed Special Field Order No. 15 in Savannah on the 16th of January, 1865. It set aside the Sea Islands and the abandoned rice country for 30 miles inland for the people who had been freed from them in plots of not more than 40 acres. Sapelo lay inside the line. The people of Sapelo were not on Sapelo to hear it. Early in the war, the Confederate command had ordered the coastal islands abandoned, and the Spalding heirs had marched the men and women they owned into the interior of Georgia. When the war ended, they walked back. The historian William McFeely, who wrote their story, put the distance at 200 miles. By August of 1865, 352 freed people were living on Sapelo Island. By December, one estimate ran to 900. They found Spalding's tabby mansion at the south end already half wrecked. According to the historian Melissa Cooper, they finished it. For a few months, the promise held. In May, the Freedmen's Bureau cut 390 acres of Spalding's land into plots and granted them to 14 men. Across the whole island, the Bureau's books recorded 745 acres issued to 25 families, 107 people in all. Then Andrew Johnson rescinded the order, and the ground went back to the families that had owned the people standing on it. So they bought it. On the northeast shoulder of the island, high above the marsh, looking across at Blackbeard Island and the open Atlantic, lay a tract called Raccoon Bluff. It was the one piece of Sapelo that Thomas Spalding had never managed to acquire, and it had passed to the heirs of a Darien merchant named George Street. In 1871, the Street heirs sold it, and the buyers were 3 freedmen who had formed a company between them. Their names were William Hillary, John Grosvenor, and Bilali Bell. The last of the 3 carried the name of the man who had run the island under Spalding, and he carried it into the first deed of black-owned land in the recorded history of Sapelo. How much land is a thing the record will not settle. Some accounts put the tract at 650 acres, others at nearly 1,000. What no one disputes is the price. William Hillary and Company bought Raccoon Bluff for $2,000, 500 of it paid down, the balance carried on a note. Hold that figure, $2,000. This account will come back to it once, at the very end, and it will not be $2,000 then. They cut the bluff into smaller parcels and sold them on to other freedmen and their families. Caesar Sams bought 60 acres at Lumber Landing. Joseph Jones bought 50 at Bell Marsh. By 1878, men and women who had themselves been property were buying ground at Shell Hammock and at Hogg Hummock from Thomas Spalding II, the grandson of the man who had owned them. A hummock on that coast is wooded ground that stands up out of the marsh, dry enough to build on. This one had been named for Samson Hogg, who had worked Spalding's fields. Hogg is also a Geechee family name. What those people made on that ground over the next 50 years is the subject of everything that follows, and it is the hardest thing in this account to see, because so little of it was ever written down. They farmed for themselves. They cut timber. Across the Sound at Darien, the largest exporter of yellow pine on the eastern seaboard of the United States, loaded ships for 30 years, and Sapelo men worked that trade as bar pilots and stevedores and sawmill hands, and came home on the tide. They took oysters out of the Duplain. The first African Baptist church was organized in 1866 at Hanging Bull, and carried to Raccoon Bluff, and the building they raised there in 1900 is standing yet. The island's school stood beside it. Their settlements ran the length of Sapelo, at Behavior and Riverside and Drinkwater, at Hanging Bull and Lumber Landing, at Shell Hammock and Bell Marsh and Hogg Hummock and Raccoon Bluff, at least 13 of them in all, and Raccoon Bluff was the capital. Count what they held. $2,000 laid on high ground in 1871, 60 acres at Lumber Landing, 50 at Bell Marsh. A church organized in a hurricane country and rebuilt when the hurricane came. A school. Nearly 400 black men, women, and children scattered across 13 settlements by 1912, and in the federal census of 1920, 294 black residents in 61 households on an island whose entire population was 299. 5 people on Sapelo Island were not Geechee. In 1884, a daughter was born there to a family named Hall, freed people. They called her Katie. She would grow up to be the island's midwife, and its last one, and across some 40 years she would put her hands under nearly every child born on Sapelo, the final one in 1968. That was the world. It lasted, whole and their own, for about 47 years. In 1912, a man from Detroit, Michigan, who had made his fortune building motor cars, came down the Georgia coast looking for an island to buy. Chapter 4. The man from Detroit, Howard Earl Coffin, grew up on a farm in Ohio and built his first automobile in an engineering shop at the University of Michigan. It ran on steam, and he used it to carry the mail. By 1910, he was one of the most important engineers in the American motor industry, the founder of the Hudson Motor Car Company of Detroit, a man who had helped standardize the parts that made mass production possible. He came to Georgia for a car race. In the early years of the century, Savannah hosted international road races that drew the whole motoring world to the coast, and Coffin came down to watch machines of the kind he built run flat out through the pine country. What he found was not the race. It was the coast itself, the marsh and the barrier islands and the mild salt winters, and the land going cheap because the plantation economy that had built it was 2 generations dead. In 1912, he bought Sapelo. He did not buy all of it. He bought the entire island except the ground the black communities already held, and he paid $100,000 and $50,000 for the rest. He was the second private man to hold nearly the whole of Sapelo, and like the first, he had arrived with plans. Where Spalding had a theory of agriculture, Coffin had a theory of improvement and the money to impose it. He laid miles of road surfaced with oyster shell. He bridged the creeks. He blasted drainage ditches through the low ground and diked the swamps and cleared the old fields and set them to cattle. He built a cannery on the island and put up oysters and shrimp. He drilled artesian wells. He brought in his young cousin, a man named Alfred Jones, to help him run it, and the two of them worked the island as a going concern. And between 1922 and 1925, on the tabby foundations of Thomas Spalding's ruined mansion at the South End, Howard Coffin built a palace. He kept Spalding's floor plan and raised over it something in the Spanish Mediterranean manner, the style he would make famous a little further up the coast. There was an indoor swimming pool and an outdoor one. There was a bowling alley in the basement, and Italian statuary, and a solarium. It was, by common agreement, the most opulent house on the Georgia coast, and it stood on the exact ground where Bilali had prayed, and where the freed people had pulled down the wreck of the old regime with their hands. The guests came by boat and by air. In December of 1928, President Calvin Coolidge and his wife Grace stayed on Sapelo and were photographed on the porch of the big house with their chow dog. In 1929, Charles Lindbergh landed an aeroplane on the island 2 years after Paris. In 1932, President Herbert Hoover came. For a decade, the private island of an automobile millionaire was a place where the powerful of the United States came to be quiet. Consider what Coffin held on that coast at the height of it. The whole of Sapelo, but for the Geechee ground, bought for $150,000. 22 years of ownership. A mansion rebuilt across 3 years with 2 swimming pools and a bowling alley. 2 sitting presidents and the most famous aviator alive entertained on the porch. And, a little to the north, an even larger idea taking shape, because when the paved roads began to reach the coast, Coffin looked at the marsh and did not see wilderness. He saw customers. The Geechee, through all of this, were still there. Coffin had not bought them out, because their land had never been for sale, and their labor built and ran the paradise. Sapelo men and women cleared his fields and canned his oysters and kept his palace. The island that $150,000 had bought still depended, as it had under Spalding, on the people the money had not been able to reach. Coffin's larger idea lay across Doughboy Sound. In the mid-20s, he and Jones bought their way onto St. Simon's Island and began to build a golf course, a yacht club, paved streets, electric light, a subdivision for the wealthy. Almost as an afterthought, Coffin bought a scrubby barrier island next door, and he gave it a name that had no history at all. He called it Sea Island. In 1928, the same year the Coolidges came to Sapelo, the Cloister Hotel opened on Sea Island, and Howard Coffin owned the two most beautiful stretches of the Georgia coast at once. He owned them on borrowed money. In October of 1929, the stock market fell, and the country began its long slide into the Depression, and the man who owned two paradises discovered that he could not afford both. Chapter 5. Which Island to Sell? The crash did not ruin Howard Coffin all at once. It ruined him the way it ruined most men who had built on credit, slowly and then completely. He had borrowed to build Sea Island. The Cloister had opened in October of 1928, 1 year almost to the week before the market broke, into a decade that would have no use for a luxury resort on the Georgia coast. The subdivision lots did not sell. The hotel ran at a loss, and the two islands that had made Howard Coffin the master of the coast now sat on his books as two mortgages he could no longer carry together. The historian Buddy Sullivan put the choice plainly. Coffin, he wrote, had two things he might sell. He could sell Sea Island and the Cloister, or he could sell Sapelo. He could not keep both. It was not, on the numbers, a close question. Sea Island was the newer investment and the deeper hole, but it was also the future, a resort with a hotel and a subdivision, and the machinery of a going business, the thing Coffin had bet his name on. Sapelo was the older love, the island that had brought him to Georgia, the palace where the presidents had come. It was also, in the middle of the Depression, an enormous private estate that produced almost nothing and cost a great deal to keep. Coffin sold Sapelo. He sold it in 1934, and the buyer was a young man from North Carolina with more money than the Depression could touch. His name was Richard Joshua Reynolds Jr., and his father had built the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, and the family fortune had come out of a cigarette called Camel. What $150,000 had bought Coffin in 1912, the tobacco heir now took off his hands, and the great house at the South End passed to its third master in 30 years. The sale kept Sea Island solvent. Alfred Jones, the young cousin, took the resort through the Depression and built it into one of the most successful in the country, and the Cloister stands today, and the Sea Island Company that grew up around it made the family that ran it wealthy for generations. Coffin's gamble, in the end, paid. It simply did not pay him. For selling Sapelo did not save Howard Coffin. It saved the company. The man himself went on sliding. He had lost the island he loved and much of the fortune he had made in Detroit, and the accounts of his last years describe not just financial ruin, but something heavier settling over him, a collapse of the spirit as much as the ledger. Consider the shape of the fall. A founder of the Hudson Motor Car Company, the man who once held the whole of Sapelo and much of St. Simon's and the island he had named Sea Island. 2 presidents entertained on his porch inside 4 years, and then, inside a decade, the island sold to pay for the island, the Detroit fortune gone, and the master of the Georgia coast reduced to a man his friends worried over. Howard Coffin died in 1937 at Sea Island of a gunshot wound. The published accounts call it self-inflicted. What can be said with certainty is only what the record holds, that a man who had lost a great deal died of a gunshot at the age of 64, 3 years after selling the island that had brought him to the coast, and that he did not live to see what the tobacco heir would do with it. Because Richard Reynolds had not bought a home. He had bought a private island at the bottom of the Depression, when a man with a cigarette fortune could buy almost anything he liked. And what he wanted from Sapelo was not what Spalding had wanted, nor what Coffin had wanted. He wanted it whole, he wanted it quiet, and he wanted the map of it simplified. There were still, in 1934, black families living in a dozen settlements across Sapelo, on land they had bought and held for 60 years, at Raccoon Bluff and Bell Marsh and Lumber Landing and Shell Hammock, at Behavior and Hanging Bull and Hogg Hummock. They held the deeds, they had the church and the school, they were, by the census, very nearly the whole population of the island. The new owner would spend the next 30 years changing that. Chapter 6. The Heir. Richard Joshua Reynolds Jr. was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, in 1906, the eldest son of the man who had made the Camel cigarette. His father had come off a Virginia tobacco farm, built a company, and in 1913 put out the first mass-produced American cigarette, and within a year had sold 425 million packs of it. When the father died in 1918, he was the richest man in North Carolina. The son inherited into that. He was 21 when he came into a trust income of $100,000 a year, and he spent it the way the newspapers of the day enjoyed reporting. He bought fast cars and aeroplanes. He financed Broadway plays. In 1927 he vanished, and the papers ran stories of foul play until he turned up in St. Louis, having taken, he said, a small vacation. In 1929, driving drunk, he struck and killed a man, was convicted of manslaughter, and spent 5 months in jail. There was a deeper darkness in the family than a young heir's recklessness. In 1932, Reynolds' younger brother Zachary was shot to death in the family house in Winston-Salem. No one was ever convicted. The case became a national sensation, and it sat behind the Reynolds name for the rest of the century. And then Richard Reynolds turned into something more serious than a playboy. He never ran the tobacco company in any real sense. What he did instead was move money. He had started a flying service in Winston-Salem in the 1920s, and out of that came his long involvement in the American airline industry. He was a major stockholder in Eastern. When Eastern would not make Winston-Salem a hub, he pulled money out and put it into a struggling southern carrier called Delta, buying a large block of its stock in 1940 and, by most accounts, keeping the airline alive. He bought a bankrupt Seattle shipping line, scrapped the old hulls, built new ones, and rode the wartime Pacific trade. He held pieces of Coca-Cola and Monsanto. He had interests in real estate and in mining. He also went into politics, and here the record turns strange. In 1940, he was elected mayor of Winston-Salem. In 1941, he became treasurer of the Democratic National Committee, and he was close enough to the Roosevelt White House that he and his wife were fixtures of wartime Washington. He had lent $300,000 to Democratic state parties, which later drew a congressional investigation. And as mayor, he took up, of all causes, public housing and slum clearance, with what his biographers describe as a particular interest in the condition of poor black Southerners. Hold that against what he was doing on Sapelo at the very same time. For the man who wished to improve the housing of poor black Southerners in North Carolina was, in those same years, methodically removing poor black Southerners from the land they owned in Georgia. Consider what the tobacco heir controlled. A fortune built on 425 million packs of cigarettes in a single year, $100,000 a year in trust income at the age of 21, a rescue stake in what became one of the great American airlines, a shipping line, a mayor's office, the treasury of a national political party, and $300,000 lent to it, and a private island on the Georgia coast, 16,000 acres of it, bought outright in the depths of the Depression for the price of a large house. He had bought Sapelo in 1934. He would use it for 30 years, never as a full-time home, always as a retreat, a hunting ground, a place to be a country gentleman a long way from Winston-Salem. He modernized the mansion. He hired a celebrated muralist to paint tropical birds and pirates on the walls. He founded a research foundation and gave land and money to the University of Georgia, and out of that would come real science, the study of the salt marsh that changed how the country understood its coasts. But the island he had bought was not empty, and the country gentleman wanted it whole. Between the mansion at the south end and the Atlantic at the north stood a dozen black settlements, the churches and the school and the burying grounds, the deeds held by families who had bought their ground when Reynolds' own father was a young man. They sat in the middle of everything he wanted to do, so he began to move them. Chapter 7. Raccoon Bluff. He did not move them all at once, and he did not, for the most part, move them by force. He moved them the way a patient man with unlimited money moves people who have very little. He moved them by arithmetic. Reynolds wanted the north end of the island for a hunting preserve, and the north end was where the Geechee lived. Raccoon Bluff, on the high ground above Blackbeard Creek, was the largest and oldest of the settlements, the capital of Black Sapelo, the place the William Hillary Company had bought in 1871. It was exactly the ground Reynolds wanted, and so, over some 15 years, Raccoon Bluff was taken apart. The method the descendants remember was the land swap. A family holding good ground on the north end would be offered a trade, an exchange of their acres for a plot at Hogg Hummock, at the marshy south-central middle of the island, out of the way of the guns. Some took the trade. Others were worn down into it. Reginald Hall, whose people were among the original Raccoon Bluff owners, and who keeps the general store on Sapelo today, has described what he was told the lawyers did to the ones who would not trade. If a family fell a little short on its taxes, he says, the company would offer a loan. The next year the family would be short again, and eventually the loan would come due, and the land would be foreclosed and taken for a fraction of its worth. That is his account, handed down, of how the holdouts were cleared. It could be done because Sapelo in those years was less a community than a holding. The islanders had been free for the better part of a century, but Reynolds and his company controlled the work, the boats, the store, the money. A man who crossed the owner of the island had nowhere on the island left to stand. By 1960, the work was nearly finished. The families had been consolidated, almost all of them, into the single square mile of Hogg Hummock. The houses at Raccoon Bluff and Bell Marsh and Lumber Landing and Shell Hammock were razed or hauled away. Reynolds built the relocated families new houses at Hogg Hummock and a new school, and he saw to a new church. Outside the one surviving settlement, he plowed the old ground flat, and the north end of the island became what he had wanted it to be, empty and green and his. The church is the part that tells the whole story in miniature. The first African Baptist congregation had been founded in 1866 at Hanging Bull, and after a hurricane destroyed that building in 1898, they had raised a new one at Raccoon Bluff at the turn of the century, on their own high ground. Under the pressure to consolidate, the congregation gave it up. In 1963, they moved their worship to Hogg Hummock, and in 1968 they built a new church there, and the old church at Raccoon Bluff was left to the weather. It stood empty for the rest of the century and fell slowly into ruin until, beginning in the year 2000, the community and the state and a college of art restored it. It stands today, whole again, in a settlement with no one left in it. It is the last building of Raccoon Bluff. Here is the arithmetic of the erasure. At least 13 black settlements on Sapelo Island at the start of the century. Some 345 black residents on the island in the census of 1930, a few years before Reynolds arrived. 1,000 acres bought at Raccoon Bluff for $2,000 in 1871 and cleared out, family by family, over 15 years. A dozen or more communities razed or abandoned. The graves around the emptied towns lost in the brush. And, by 1960, one settlement left standing where there had been 13, holding all the Geechee of Sapelo on 434 acres of the island's least wanted ground. Recall the figure this account set down to hold. $2,000 laid at Raccoon Bluff in 1871. That was the first time the 1,000 acres changed hands. This was the second, and no money changed hands at all. There would be a third. Richard Reynolds did not live to see the state take the island off his widow's hands. By 1960, he was already a sick man, and the illness that was killing him had a particular irony to it, because the fortune that had bought Sapelo had been built, packet by packet, on the very thing that was closing his lungs. Chapter 8. The Pond and the Gold. The fortune had been built on tobacco, and tobacco killed him. Richard Reynolds had smoked Camels since he was a boy, the family brand, the packet his father had put into the hands of the world. In 1960, the doctors told him he had emphysema. He promised his last wife that he would stop, and he did not stop, and the disease closed his lungs by degrees over the next 4 years while he carried an oxygen bottle and, near the end, slept inside an oxygen tent. His grandson Patrick Reynolds, who would grow up to spend his life campaigning against the industry that made his family, told the story of the cigarettes in the book he wrote about them. By the early 60s, Reynolds was on Sapelo, ill, forbidden tobacco. His fourth wife, Anne Marie, discovered that he was bribing one of the household servants to smuggle him cigarettes against the doctor's orders. When she found out, according to Patrick's account, she fired the entire household staff on the spot, some with more than 20 years of service. They were Hogg Hummock people. The families Reynolds had spent 30 years pressing into that 1 square mile now lost, in an afternoon, the work that the pressing had left them. The last years on the island had a strange unraveling quality. In the 50s, with his third wife, Reynolds had a pond dug on the estate shaped to represent the oceans of the world and the 7 continents. It was said he kept $1 million in bearer bonds locked in a closet, cash to draw on if the world's markets fell. And in a final episode before he left Sapelo for the last time, he and some of his servants went out into the woods and dug up bags of gold that he had buried there against some disaster that never came. He deeded most of the island to his research foundation, gave up his seat on the board of Delta, sold off what remained of his American holdings, and in 1961 he married Anne Marie and left the country. He spent his final 2 years in Lucerne, in Switzerland, a long way from the Georgia coast he had loved, and he died there on the 14th of December, 1964, at the age of 58. 2 days later, Anne Marie bore his only daughter. A few months before the end, he had written out a new will in his own hand, revoking every earlier one, and left the whole of his estate to her, and cut all 6 of his sons out entirely. Consider the ledger of the man who had rearranged an island. A tobacco fortune reckoned in the tens of millions, and possibly the hundreds. 4 marriages, 3 of them ending in divorce courts that entertained the country. 16,000 acres of Georgia held for 30 years. A pond in the shape of the 7 seas. $1 million in bonds behind a locked door, and bags of gold in the ground. 6 sons, disinherited by a page of handwriting. And 1 cause of death, emphysema, written on the certificate of the heir to the Camel fortune. The irony did not end with him. His eldest son, Richard Joshua Reynolds III, called Josh, the boy who had been 11 the last time he saw his father well, grew up and smoked and died of emphysema, the same disease, the same brand, 1 generation down. Reynolds had not settled what would happen to Sapelo. He had deeded much of it to a foundation and left the rest to a widow who had no attachment to a barrier island in Georgia and lived in the Alps. For 5 years the island sat in that suspension, its owner dead, its future unspoken, its 1 surviving black settlement waiting to see who the new landlord would be. The new landlord, when it came, was the state of Georgia. Chapter 9. The state becomes the landlord. Anne Marie Reynolds did not want a Georgia barrier island. She was a Swiss psychiatrist with a doctorate in philosophy, 30 years younger than the husband she had buried, and her life was in Europe. What she had inherited was 16,000 acres of marsh and forest an ocean away, and in 2 transactions she handed it to the state of Georgia. The first came in 1969, the second in 1976. Together the state paid $1 million for the bulk of Sapelo Island, a figure that even at the time was understood to be a fraction of what the land was worth. Governor Jimmy Carter, a hunter and a conservationist, accepted the second conveyance himself. The transfer was treated, then and since, as an act of preservation, a great wild island passing out of private hands and into the public trust, saved from the fate of the other sea islands, from the golf courses and the gated resorts that had swallowed Hilton Head and Sea Island and St. Simon's. That is one way to tell it. There is another, and it is told on Sapelo. In the account of Reginald Hall and others in the community, the state's acquisition was not only a rescue of wilderness, it was also the final closing of a door. For as long as Sapelo had been owned by 1 man, there was at least the theoretical possibility that the Geechee might one day buy back what had been taken from them at Raccoon Bluff and the other raised settlements. Once the land passed to the state of Georgia and was declared a wildlife management area and an estuarine reserve, that possibility narrowed close to nothing. In Hall's framing, turning the north end into a preserve made it 100 times harder to get the land back. The wilderness designation was, he argues, as much a way of keeping the ground out of Gullah Geechee hands as it was a haven for sportsmen and nature lovers. The state built its institutions on the island. There was the Richard J. Reynolds Wildlife Management Area, carrying the name of the man who had emptied the north end, laid across the very ground he had emptied. There was the University of Georgia Marine Institute at the south end, in Reynolds' old dairy complex, where the study of the salt marsh that Reynolds Foundation had funded went on and produced real and lasting science. There was the Sapelo Island National Estuarine Research Reserve along the western marsh, and to manage the state's relationship with the one piece of the island it did not own, the legislature would in time create a body called the Sapelo Island Heritage Authority. Consider what the state of Georgia acquired for its $1 million. 16,000 acres of barrier island, very nearly the whole of it. 97% of Sapelo in the end. Miles of undeveloped Atlantic beach, a salt marsh that would help rewrite the science of the American coast, a mansion with 2 swimming pools and a bowling alley, and a single privately held enclave at the center of it, 434 acres, holding the last of the island's Geechee on the ground that no owner, in 200 years, had ever quite managed to take. 97% and 3%. That was the map now, and it has scarcely changed since. On the mainland, at Meridian, where the ferry casts off for the island, the state built a visitor center to receive the tourists and the school groups and tell them what Sapelo is. There are photographs in it, and exhibits, and panels of explanatory text describing the island's history and its owners. What that text chooses to say, and the names it chooses to leave out, is the last thing this account will come to. Hold it until then. For the Geechee, the change of landlord did not settle anything. It rearranged the terms. Where once they had answered to a tobacco heir who controlled the boats and the store and the work, now they answered to a state government and to the county that taxed them, and to a set of agencies that managed the land around their homes and the road to their cemetery and the dock they crossed to reach the mainland. And a government, it would turn out, can press on a small community in ways that even a rich man cannot. It can assess, it can zone, it can tax. The first of those pressures to fall on Hogg Hummock arrived with a particular cruelty as a piece of paper that called itself Good News. It was a new valuation of their land. Chapter 10. The Midwife's Book. To understand what was at stake on Sapelo, it helps to leave the owners for a while and stand in the place itself in the years before the taxes came. Consider the working life of Katie Hall, the daughter born at Raccoon Bluff in 1884. She began delivering babies in the 1920s, and for the next 40 years she was the midwife of Sapelo Island, and for most of that time she was the only one. There was no doctor living on the island. There was no hospital nearer than the mainland, across a sound with no bridge. When a child came on Sapelo, it came into the hands of Katie Hall. She lived at the north end, at Raccoon Bluff, and she carried a black bag everywhere she went, packed with her medicines and her remedies. She also carried a small book, and in the book she wrote down the name of every child she brought into the world. There is a story told of her that she delivered a baby at the north end one morning and then walked 7 miles to the south end and delivered another that evening. It is said that in all her years she never lost a child in a delivery. By the time she put down the bag in 1968, she had delivered nearly every living soul on the island. The men and women who would spend the next half-century fighting for Hogg Hummock had, most of them, arrived in the world in the hands of Katie Hall. Her name should be held on to. It is not finished with this account. This was the world the owner's arithmetic was pressing on. Not an abstraction, not a demographic, but a place with a midwife who knew every name, a place where a woman could walk the length of an island because she knew she would be needed at both ends of it. It was a place people wrote down before it could vanish. Cornelia Walker Bailey, born on Sapelo in 1945, became the island's griot, its keeper of stories, and in 2000 she published a memoir of the place with a title that carried its whole spirit, a book about God and the root doctor and the numbers man. She spent her life telling the history of Sapelo from the inside, insisting that the Geechee were not a curiosity for tourists, but a people with a homeland, and she counted among her own ancestors the man Bilali who had prayed on that island a century and a half before. She died in 2017. Much of what the outside world knows of Sapelo it knows because she refused to let it be forgotten. Consider what this small place produced and held, a community founded by people who bought their freedom's ground with cash, a church organized in 1866 and still gathering, a midwife who delivered an entire island, and never lost a child. A dialect, Geechee, carrying the grammar of West Africa into the 20th century. Ring shouts and sweetgrass baskets and cast nets and the names of 13 settlements. And a woman who wrote it all into a book so that when the settlements were gone, the memory of them would not be. By the early 1950s, there were perhaps 200 Geechee left in Hogg Hummock. By the 1980s, about 125. The young people left for the mainland where there was work, and the old people stayed, and the ferry carried the island's children across the Sound to school and carried them back. The community was shrinking, but it was intact. It held its ground, the 434 acres, the deeds, the church, the burying grounds. Whatever the state owned around them, Hogg Hummock was theirs, held by descent and by paper going back to the years just after slavery. And then, in the autumn of 2012, the county sent the people of Hogg Hummock a new assessment of what their land was worth. For some of them, the figure had risen by more than 500%. Chapter 11. The Avalanche. The paper that arrived in the autumn of 2012 did not look like an attack. It looked like a compliment. The county had decided that the land under Hogg Hummock was worth a great deal more than anyone had previously said. That was the mechanism, and it was almost elegant in its cruelty. Through the 1990s and after, people from the mainland had begun buying up parcels in Hogg Hummock to build vacation houses, and they paid mainland prices for coastal land. The McIntosh County Board of Assessors then looked at what those outsiders had paid and used it to reappraise every lot in the community, including the lots of families who had held their ground since Reconstruction and had no intention of ever selling. The measure of a Geechee family's tax was now the price a wealthy stranger was willing to pay for the plot next door. The bills that followed were staggering. Annie Watts, a Sapelo native who was 73 years old, saw her assessment rise by 540%. Some residents put their own increases higher still, at 600%, even 1,000. And the particular insult inside the injury was the reason the county gave for part of the rise. It was to pay for a new garbage collection service in McIntosh County, a service that did not extend to Sapelo Island. The people of Hogg Hummock were being taxed for trash pickup they did not receive. They hauled their own garbage, as they always had, to a compactor on the island and to the dump. It was not only the trash. For decades, the county had collected property taxes from Sapelo at the same rate as the mainland, while providing almost nothing in return. There was no school on the island. There was no firehouse and no proper fire truck until 2010, when the county left an old decommissioned engine sitting on Sapelo, exposed to the weather. There was no reliable ambulance. A medical emergency on Sapelo meant getting yourself across the Sound before the county's service began. The dirt roads of the mainland were graded weekly. The dirt roads of Hogg Hummock were graded once or twice a year. So the community did what the community had always done. It went to law. In 2015, a group of Sapelo taxpayers challenged the assessments, and the county settled rather than fight it out. The consent judgment used language the county's own lawyers had agreed to, acknowledging that the dramatically rising assessments of recent years had threatened the very survival of the Hogg Hummock community. 34 parcels received refunds. The total returned to the islanders came to $138,165.37. That same year, the community went further and filed suit in federal court, arguing that the whole pattern, the taxes without services, was racial discrimination in violation of the Constitution. That case would take years, and it belongs in the next part of this account. Consider the arithmetic of belonging on Sapelo Island in these years. A tax assessment raised 540% on a woman of 73. A charge levied for garbage collection that never came to the island. No school, no firehouse for the first decades of the century, and then a broken truck. Roads touched once or twice a year, 34 parcels refunded, and $138,000 returned, as the price of proving the community should not have been billed that way in the first place. And a tax rate identical to the mainland's, paid on an island the mainland's government had spent a century declining to serve. The lawsuits bought the community something precious, which was time. As part of the settlements, the property taxes on Hogg Hummock were effectively frozen, held down for about 10 years, so that the families could stay. But a freeze is a thing that ends. The clock it started was quietly running the whole time, and when it ran out, the assessors would be waiting, with the same arithmetic and a far larger number. Before that, though, the fight moved to different ground. Because taxes were only one of the levers a government could pull on a small community. There was another, quieter one, and in the summer of 2023, a man who wanted to build a bigger house reached for it. Chapter 12. Suing for Water. The federal lawsuit the community filed in 2015 was, at bottom, an argument about arithmetic and race. The county, the plaintiffs said, had collected taxes from the black families of Sapelo for generations while withholding the services those taxes were meant to buy, and it had done so because the families were black. The suit named the county, and it named the state, and it asked the court to call the pattern what the residents believed it was: discrimination written into a tax ledger. The claims against the state of Georgia were settled first, in 2020, and the terms mattered more than anyone could have known at the time. The residents' quarrel with the state was largely about the crossing. Sapelo has no bridge. Everything and everyone reaches it by boat, and the boats and the docks belonged to the state. The community argued that the transportation the state provided was inadequate and inaccessible, that the ferry schedule stranded people who worked or went to school on the mainland, and that the docks could not properly serve the elderly and the disabled. In the settlement, the state agreed to fix it. It committed to invest millions of dollars in the ferry and the docks, to expand the schedule, and to rebuild the landings so that they would be accessible to everyone who used them. The community had sued the state of Georgia for safe passage to and from its own homes, and the community had won. The state was now obliged to build new docks. Hold that. It matters later, and not in the way anyone intended. The fight with the county took longer. It was a harder case and a closer one, and it ground on for years, through filings and appeals, and, in 2022, a mediation session that ran 15 hours in a single sitting. In the end, the county, like the state, chose to settle rather than let a jury decide whether it had spent a century discriminating against the people of Sapelo. It agreed to provide financial compensation to the residents and, more importantly, to begin actually delivering the services it had so long collected for: the trash pickup, the emergency response, the road maintenance, the things the mainland had always taken for granted. Consider what it had cost and what it had bought. A federal civil rights case running from 2015 to 2022. A settlement with the state built around a promise to rebuild the docks and the ferry. A separate settlement with the county after a 15-hour mediation. Two governments brought at last, to the table by a community of fewer than 50 full-time residents, on the strength of a claim they had been treated unequally for 100 years. It was, by any measure, a remarkable run of legal victories for so small a place. And yet none of it touched the thing that most threatened Hogg Hummock: because the deepest danger to the community was not the taxes, and not the missing fire truck, and not the ferry schedule. It was the arithmetic underneath all of them, the simple fact that the land the Geechee sat on had become to the outside world extremely valuable. Every legal victory slowed the pressure. None of it removed the reason the pressure existed. As long as a half acre in Hogg Hummock was worth what a wealthy buyer would pay for a view of the marsh, someone would always be working out a way to get the Geechee off it, whether through a tax bill or a foreclosure or an appraisal or a change to the rules about what could be built there. And in the summer of 2023, the rules about what could be built there were exactly what came under attack. The instrument this time was not a tax, it was a zoning ordinance. And it began, as these things on Sapelo so often had, with a wealthy newcomer who wanted something the old rules would not let him have. Chapter 13. 3,000 square feet. The rule that protected Hogg Hummock was a number. Since the 1990s, the county's own zoning code had capped the size of a house in the community at 1,400 square feet of heated space. It was a modest number, and it was deliberate. A small cap kept the houses small, and small houses kept the land assessments low, and low assessments kept the taxes within reach of families that had never been wealthy. The 1,400 square foot ceiling was, in effect, the thing standing between the Geechee and the tax avalanche. Everyone involved understood this. The zoning district's stated purpose said so in plain words, naming the community's need for protection from land speculators. In the summer of 2023, that number came under attack, and the attack did not come from the community. According to county correspondence later obtained through an open records request, the first draft of a new ordinance was emailed to the county manager and the county attorney on the 14th of July, 2023, by a man named Bill Hodges. Hodges was an engineer from St. Simon's Island. He owned a house in Hogg Hummock, and he sat on a county development authority board. His message called it the first draft of the ordinance they had discussed. Reached later by a reporter, Hodges said he had only volunteered his help, reviewed and edited documents, and not created them. Either way, 2 months before the public on Sapelo saw anything, a draft to loosen the rules on their community was moving between a non-descendant landowner and the county's officials. What the draft proposed was to more than double the cap, to raise the ceiling from 1,400 square feet to 3,000, and to allow houses up to 37 feet tall. The public hearing was set for the 7th of September at the courthouse in Darien, on the mainland. The community came. About 200 people filled the room to speak against the change. They were not allowed to bring recording equipment or phones, and the hearing had been scheduled for the evening, after the last ferry of the day had left the mainland for the island. This is the moment the account began with. The people of Sapelo, who had come to defend their homes, now faced a choice that the scheduling had built for them. They could stay in the courthouse and fight for the ordinance, and then have no way home, no ferry, no bridge, and a night on the mainland. Or they could leave, mid-hearing, to catch the last boat. They left. To reach the island they had lived on all their lives, they had to walk out of the room where its future was being decided. And here is what happened after they were gone. This is the answer the account has been holding since its first minutes. The 3 members of the County Planning and Zoning Commission stayed in the emptied room. They took about half an hour to pencil in some changes to the proposal, small adjustments in response to the public comment they had heard. They did not restore the language about protecting the community from speculators. And then the 3 of them voted unanimously to recommend the ordinance to the County Commission for approval. 5 days later, on the 12th of September, the 5-member McIntosh County Commission met to take the final vote. The commissioner, whose district actually contained Sapelo Island, Roger Lotson, voted no and tried to postpone the decision. A second commissioner voted no with him. The chairman cast a deciding vote in favor. The measure passed, 3-2. The cap on a house in Hogg Hummock was now 3,000 square feet, and the protection built into the old number was gone. Consider what had just been made possible. A house size limit more than doubled, from 1,400 square feet to 3,000. A ceiling raised to 37 feet. A draft written with the help of a man from St. Simon's who wanted to build. A hearing scheduled after the last ferry, in a room where phones were forbidden. A recommendation penciled in and passed by 3 people in half an hour after the community had gone home. And a final vote of 3-2, with the island's own commissioner among the 2 who lost. Larger houses meant higher values. Higher values meant higher assessments. Higher assessments meant the tax avalanche. The community had spent a decade holding back, now released by the stroke of a pen onto families who could not pay it. The county said it was helping. The community heard something else, and it did the only thing it had ever been able to do. It prepared to fight, and this time it would fight on 2 fronts at once, in the courts and at the ballot box. But first, McIntosh County would do something so strange that it is difficult to describe without appearing to invent it. The county would go to court to sue its own judge. Chapter 14. The county sues its own judge. The community fought on 2 fronts. On the first, 9 black residents of Sapelo sued McIntosh County in the Superior Court, arguing that the rezoning was unjust and discriminatory, a deliberate move to price the Geechee off their land. That case, carried by the Southern Poverty Law Center and an Atlanta firm, would grind on slowly, and is grinding on still. The second front was older and stranger, and, in the end, more powerful. It was the ballot. Georgia's Constitution contains a rarely used provision, a piece of what is called Home Rule, that lets the voters of a county repeal an act of their own local government, much as they might recall an official. The people of Sapelo and their neighbors on the mainland set out to use it. They needed the signatures of 20% of the county's registered voters to force a referendum on the zoning. They gathered them. More than 2,000 people signed, well past the threshold, and the petition went to the county's probate judge, Harold Webster, whose job it was to check it. Webster found the petition valid and set a special election. The people of McIntosh County would vote on whether to repeal the 3,000-square-foot ordinance. And here, McIntosh County did the thing that is hard to state without sounding as though one has got it wrong. The county sued its own probate judge to stop the vote. It filed suit against Harold Webster, its own elected official, in his official capacity, arguing that zoning ordinances were not subject to the Home Rule referendum and that Webster had no authority to have called the election. A senior Superior Court judge, Gary McCorvey, agreed with the county, and so the referendum was halted, not before it began, but in the middle of it. Early voting was already underway. Nearly 800 people had already cast their ballots on the future of Hogg Hummock when the judge shut the election down. The absurdity of the arrangement was not lost on anyone, least of all, later, on the justices of the state's highest court. A county suing one of its own officials in his official capacity is a county suing itself, and a county suing itself must pay the lawyers on both sides. McIntosh County, which had complained loudly that it could not afford the $20,000 to staff the polls for the election, now funded the attorneys defending its judge and the attorneys attacking him, and its legal bills on the referendum case alone climbed past $120,000, with a further sum past $150,000 on the residence discrimination suit. Consider the ledger of a county at WEOR with its own voters. More than 2,000 signatures gathered to force a vote. A referendum validated by the county's own probate judge. A lawsuit by the county against that same judge to stop the county's own citizens from voting. An election halted with nearly 800 ballots already cast. $20,000 called too expensive to run the vote, and more than $250,000 spent to litigate against it. And a small, rural county, most of it too poor to be taxed, pouring its money into keeping 50 Geechee families from repealing a rule about the size of a house. The residents appealed the shutdown, and the matter went up to the Supreme Court of Georgia, along with the two tangled cases between the county and its judge. The court heard argument in the spring of 2025, and when the case reached that court, it carried a name at the top of its caption, in the way that cases do, taken from the residents who had brought it. The lead plaintiffs were three descendants of Sapelo, and their names were Barbara Bailey, Christopher Bailey, and Stanley Walker. Recall the names this account set down long ago, the names the people of Sapelo carried with them out of slavery, off Spalding's cotton fields, and into their own free settlements. Bailey, Walker, the same names that had been on the island since Bilali's daughters, since the first deeds at Raccoon Bluff. The case was styled Bailey against McIntosh County. 160 years after emancipation, the descendants of the enslaved were still in a Georgia courtroom, still fighting for the right to remain on the ground their ancestors had bought, and their family name was now the name of the case that would decide it. What the Supreme Court of Georgia decided, and what came after, belongs at the end. But between the argument and the answer, on a bright October afternoon during the annual celebration of everything Sapelo had managed to keep, the island suffered the worst single day in its modern history. Chapter 15. The Gangway. Every year, on the third Saturday of October, the people of Sapelo hold Cultural Day. Descendants who have moved away come home. There are ring shouts and sweetgrass baskets, smoked mullet and red rice, African dance, and demonstrations of the old crafts, all of it a celebration of the culture that 2 centuries of pressure had failed to erase. It is the one day a year the island fills with people. On the 19th of October, 2024, about 700 people came. To carry that many visitors, the state ran both of its ferries between the mainland at Meridian and the dock at Marsh Landing on the island. The 2 boats are named for 2 women. One is the Katie Underwood, named for the midwife who was born at Raccoon Bluff in 1884 and delivered nearly every child on the island across 40 years. This account asked long ago that her name be held onto. Here it is. The people of Sapelo cross the water on a boat that carries the name of the woman who brought most of them into the world. The other ferry is named the Anna Marie, for the tobacco heir's widow who sold the island to the state of Georgia. Late that afternoon, as Cultural Day ended and the visitors began the crossing home, a crowd gathered on the gangway that ran from the dock down to the ferry Anne Marie. As many as 40 people were on it, and the gangway, a metal ramp about 80 feet long, gave way beneath them and dropped some 20 people into the tidal water below. 7 of them died. They were Jacqueline Cruz Carter, 75, Cynthia Gibbs, 74, Charles Houston, 77, a chaplain who had served the state's own agencies and preached for 40 years, William Johnson, 73, Carlotta McIntosh, 93, Isaiah Thomas, 79, and Queen Welch, 76. The youngest was 73. Every one of them was elderly. None of them lived on Sapelo. They had come as guests to celebrate the island's survival, and they drowned in sight of its shore while trying to go home. The state called it a catastrophic structural failure. The gangway had been built in 2021 and was only 3 years old. And here is the part that turns the grief into something harder. That gangway existed because the community had won. The docks and the ferry landings at Marsh Landing had been rebuilt as a direct result of the settlement the residents had wrung out of the state of Georgia in 2020. The settlement in which the state agreed to fix the crossing and make it safe and accessible. The old dock was demolished and a new one built with a new 80-foot gangway under the terms of that agreement. The community had gone to court for safe passage to its own island. The state had built the new structure to satisfy the judgment, and it was that structure, 3 years later, that collapsed and killed 7 elderly guests on the one day the island opened itself to the world. The settlement had been reached in October of 2020. The gangway failed on the 19th of October, 2024, 4 years later, almost to the day. Consider what fell on Sapelo that afternoon. 7 dead, the youngest 73, the oldest 93. Some 20 people dropped into the water at low tide, 40 or more on a ramp built to be safe. A structure 3 years old, a celebration of survival turned in an afternoon into the worst single day in the island's modern history, and a crossing that existed only because the people of Sapelo had gone to law and won the right to cross safely. The dead were not islanders, but the island grieved them as its own because they had come to honor it and because on Sapelo, as the county's one black commissioner said, "Everyone is family." The investigations began. The lawyers came. The demands for a federal inquiry were made, and the questions about who had inspected the gangway and when, and whether the state should be permitted to investigate its own dock were asked and are being asked still. And through all of it, unresolved, the case that would be called Bailey against McIntosh County was winding toward the Supreme Court of Georgia, holding the future of the island's homes in suspension, while the island buried the visitors who had come to celebrate it. The answer from the court would come in the autumn of 2025. Chapter 16, 85%. On the 30th of September 2025, the Supreme Court of Georgia gave its answer, and the answer was unanimous. The court ruled that the people of McIntosh County had every right to repeal the zoning ordinance at the ballot box, that the county had been wrong to sue its own judge to stop them, and that the referendum halted mid-vote the year before must be allowed to proceed. It also held the new zoning frozen in the meantime so that no house larger than the old 1,400-square-foot limit could be built while the matter was settled. After 2 years, the highest court in the state had sided completely with Hogg Hummock. The referendum was finally held on the 20th of January 2026. It was not close. Of the ballots cast, 1,584 voted to repeal the 3,000-square-foot ordinance, and 285 voted to keep it. 85% of the county had voted to protect the Geechee community, better than 5-1. The rule that had doubled the size of a house in Hogg Hummock was struck down by the people of the county themselves. It was a stunning victory, and it settled almost nothing, because striking down the ordinance left Hogg Hummock with no zoning at all, and the county now had to write a new rule. Through the first half of 2026, the commission tried and stumbled and tried again. It held listening sessions. It floated a cap of 1,800 square feet, and its own zoning board set it aside as full of loopholes, and its own attorney told it to go back to the drawing board. As this account is assembled, in July of 2026, the county is pushing a fresh draft capping houses at 1,550 square feet, racing to adopt something before a building moratorium expires on the 10th of August. The fight over the size of a house on Sapelo is, at this moment, still unresolved, and behind the zoning fight, the older weapon has been quietly raised again. For the first time since 2012, the county's assessors have moved to revalue the land in Hogg Hummock. The chief appraiser has said plainly what is coming. A half-acre lot assessed at around $27,500 could be reassessed at as much as $145,000. The increase would be phased in over 3 years, a third at a time, and would see some tax bills climb from roughly $1,800 toward $10,000. To leave the values alone, the appraiser said, is not an option. The freeze that the lawsuits bought a decade ago has expired, and the avalanche the community held back in 2012 is beginning, again, to move. Recall the figure this account set down to hold near the beginning. $2,000 paid by 3 freedmen for 1,000 acres at Raccoon Bluff in 1871. That was the first time the 1,000 acres changed hands. The second was when Reynolds took them, family by family, and no money changed hands at all. Here is the third. There is now a case in the Georgia courts, brought on behalf of the descendants, seeking the return of the value of that North End land. The figure the community's advocates put on those 1,000 acres today is $2 billion. $2,000 in 1871, $2 billion in 2026. The same 1,000 acres, the same high ground above Blackbeard Creek, 1,000,000-fold across 155 years, and the descendants of the men who paid the 2,000 are still trying to get it back. Consider, finally, where Sapelo Island stands today. 16,500 acres, 97% of them owned by the state of Georgia, 434 acres left to the Geechee, 1 square mile, the last intact Gullah community on the coast, fewer than 50 full-time residents, the oldest of them 93, 13 settlements reduced to 1, a house size rule doubled, repealed by 85% of the county, and not yet rewritten, a land valuation set to climb from $27,000 a lot toward $145,000, more than $500,000 in county legal fees spent fighting the community, 7 dead on a state-built gangway, and a $2 billion claim on 1,000 acres that once cost $2,000. The people of Hogg Hummock are still there. They cross the water on the Katie Underwood, named for the woman who delivered them, and on the Anne Marie, named for the woman who sold their island. One of the ferry captains is a descendant of William Hillary, who signed the first deed in 1871. The fight is not over. The moratorium expires in weeks. The reassessment is coming. And the last question, the one this account has held back to the end, is not about the island's people at all. It is about how the rest of the world has chosen to remember them. On the mainland at Meridian, where the ferries leave for Sapelo, the state of Georgia keeps a visitor center with photographs and panels of text that tell arrivals whose island they are about to see. The story on the wall is largely the story of the 3 rich men who owned Sapelo: Spalding the planter, Coffin the industrialist, Reynolds the tobacco heir, whose name is on the mansion and the wildlife area both. Raccoon Bluff is not at the center of it. Neither is Bilali, nor Katie Underwood, nor the 1,000 acres, nor the freedmen who paid $2,000 for them. The island keeps changing hands on paper, but the people who never left are the ones who made it a place worth remembering at all.